Dr. Samanta is a board-certified movement disorders neurologist in private practice in Phoenix, Arizona, and a clinical professor of neurology at the University of Arizona College of Medicine in Tucson, Arizona. He's also a clinical lecturer at the Phoenix Medical School campus of the University of Arizona. Dr. Samanta received his medical degree from the Medical College of Pennsylvania before completing an internship in internal medicine at St. Joseph's Hospital and Medical Center and a residency in neurology at Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. He completed his postgraduate training at the Evelyn Kosak Movement Disorders Fellows at the Muhammad Ali Parkinson Research Center at Barrow Neurological Institute. Dr. Samanta's research interests include motor learning and exercise in Parkinson's disease, non-motor symptoms in Parkinson's, and surgical and non-surgical management of tremor and dystonia. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Samanta.
Well, thank you, and thank you everybody for joining on with the podcast, or I guess webcast. Sorry, podcast. I'm not techie enough to even know what the difference is anymore. But Parkinson's is something that's very near and dear to my heart. It's something I spent a lot of my adult life working to better understand and to get to know and help people dealing with Parkinson's. And I was really excited when you approached me about this topic. We obviously, and rightfully so, we focus a lot on the patient experience and in Parkinson's disease, and how do we make the person with PD, how do we make their life better, how do we get through this and improve outcomes and what have you. But sometimes what we may forget about, or what doesn't always get enough attention or thought, is that really, with almost any chronic condition that affects someone, that condition also affects or has a ripple effect on the people who care about that person, spouses, children of the person, other partners, other close family, friends, anyone who maybe is involved on some level in the day-to-day care and caring for these individuals. And so, because Parkinson's in particular is, it's a 24, I think everybody understands out there. It's, you don't get any vacations. It's a 24/7 thing. And it's very work intensive. You're taking medications way more often and with more rigid timelines than we expect of just about anybody else with any other condition out there. And how you feel and function can vary greatly, across just minutes, and multiple times per day. And so there's a lot of moving parts in Parkinson's, not to even begin to get into it's progressive. It has all these other components. And while we're focused on the nuts and bolts of that, we have people who are in the home, with people who are seeing you every day, who really are on some levels just as invested in how you're doing, because of lots of reasons, because they care about you, because you're the leader of the family, because you're their best friend, because for hundreds of reasons, how you're doing is important to the people around you. we can focus a little bit on, partners and spouses. So, you go through your life, you make plans together, you have dreams about what you're going to do, you know, the rest of your lives together and what have you. And then we throw this curveball into things and uh it- you know, suddenly neither of you know exactly, well, what does this mean for us? What does it mean for, 5 years from now? Or what, should we, do we just put everything on hold? Do we put everything away, period, in terms of plans? Or do we, or is it just as well that if, as long as we can, we try to just plow through? And I think that's a tough journey for patients, but it's important to remember it's actually, top often involving multiple people. I think anytime there's a chronic condition, the hardest part is like, well, what happens next, or what happens in 5 years? And it's not just what are we going to do? Oh darn, we don't get to go to Yellowstone, or we're not going to go, to Alaska or something. It's also, well, am I going to be healthy enough to take care of, John or Linda, the person I love or care about, in 5 years? Because maybe we're both in our 70s and I'm not 100% healthy either. And that's a complex, emotional situation as a caregiver, because you feel torn. It is easy to feel torn between wanting to take care of your loved one and yet somehow still taking care of yourself. And I think that's one of the areas that people really struggle with as caregivers. There could be a lot of guilt as a caregiver about trying to take care of your own needs. And that's something that, we don't really talk about, or try to help people find a pathway to, find balance. There's also, in relationships, we all tend to over time develop roles like, oh, well, yeah, well, I'm the cook and you're the bill payer, and when we make big life decisions, I've always given you the last word. I got my input, but it always felt good that, my spouse was the one that put like the okay on things. And now I'm worried, well, maybe that isn't going to happen, or maybe we shouldn't, we can't keep that balance there. Or maybe sometimes the situation is, boy, I know I need to take on more of this decision making, or more of the control in, our finances or what have you. And yet maybe the spouse, the person affected, doesn't agree, or isn't ready, or is very wounded by that, even if they do agree. And then so there are these shifts in, I guess, even though we don't like to think of loving relationships as involving power, yeah, they do on some level. And when there's that shift where things don't feel as equal, that can be really, really traumatic for both sides, to suddenly go from partner to, well, now I'm telling you when to take your medicine. I'm telling you, don't, you need to, why did you get up without your walker? And these sorts of things. Or the therapist says you should be walking like this. And I think if there's anyone out there who hasn't experienced that, a coach or a therapist can tell you, can be pretty blunt with you, and you'll just, oh, okay, I guess I didn't realize I should do that. But the moment our spouse says, verbatim the same thing. We often, sort of kind of get a little spiky, a little bit prickly about those things, and that's normal, but normal doesn't make it fun. And so one of the things that I counsel patients about is you have to talk about these things and try to find a middle ground where your caregiver, your spouse, your partner is able to be helpful or cue, because in Parkinson's, you sometimes really do need external cues to help you, break out of a freezing spell or shuffling, or make sure that you're all the way to the chair when you start to sit down. And how, if that feels naggy, then you have to have a discussion where, how do we do this so that we don't get it, we don't get cross with each other. And there are probably, times where that's unavoidable, but if you talk about it, and if you share, and if you maybe even find times where you can laugh about it, it doesn't have to be this building thing. And I think that's the key. There isn't any one thing about caregiving that is going to be simple or easy, but not having or not establishing safe communication between you is always going to make it harder. And so sometimes that really does require some counseling, or it might require a drawing in a third party to talk through this with, and where we can kind of take the tension out of it, or take the pressure out of certain conflicts, and talk them through, and understand that we're both really trying to get to the same thing, which is living our best life. I think one of the other things that is difficult for caregivers is just not knowing, how protective should I be, right? Is it, do I see in my end of the relationship, I see sort of the whole spectrum from, some spouses who don't want to interfere in any way, shape, or form on their loved ones' autonomy, decision making, and maybe almost to the point where they might be, there are situations that are maybe not so healthy that are happening, and they're too afraid to intervene, or to sort of, kind of uh yeah, sort of crush the independence of the person with Parkinson's. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are those who sort of almost become, and this sounds terrible, and but I'm going to use it just because it's ribbon. It is the extreme, kind of a warden, or the, sort of uh, the total controller of everything. And I think neither of those extremes is ever truly healthy, even when we're talking about, very dependent patients and very independent patients, or people with Parkinson's. I think there's, I think, on very simple terms, I tell many of my patients, you could be at home in a chair with Parkinson's, or you could be out looking at the Grand Canyon, or traveling with Parkinson's. The Parkinson's doesn't care. So then it's just a matter of a hassle factor, and maybe having to, sort of do more prep to do these things. But I think if what I if I'm going to err in, maybe if I suggest erring in one direction or another, I tend to advise, households or couples or families that, remember that activity and stimulation is neuroprotective on some level. And, and that for decades in medicine, we tended to be overprotective of folks who are quote unquote not well or chronically ill. And all that does is make someone who's vulnerable and take them and make them frail. And so could you fall, on a RV trip across the Rockies? Could you fall stepping out of the RV and break a hip? Yes. But if you're home all the time, you know, well, first off, where do most falls and fractures happen? Well, they happen in the home. So the most, quote unquote, the most dangerous place, if you're going to follow that fear, is actually staying at home. So, these things, I think we let our protectiveness or what have you kind of sometimes drive things too strongly, and balance is always the way to go. I think finding, and we didn't used to have these not that many years ago, but now, caregiver resources, caregiver support groups are much more available, or are much more developed around the whole country. And I, what, despite all the, some of the more glib things I've said, being a caregiver is not easy. We ask of ourselves as caregivers to do what, in a assisted living or a hospital setting would be covered by usually two individuals at working 8-hour shifts, which is really, so that means you're doing the job of 6 people as a caregiver, and you're doing it 24/7 with no vacations. And if you step away and you think of it that way, well, that's insane, right? You would never ask anybody to work like that. And yet that's what we do. And it's coming from a place of love and caring and commitment. But I think it underscores the way I think we can sometimes almost feel like we've entrapped ourselves into a situation, and having other people to talk about these things with, and to hear, well, what do you do? And was that easy, or was it hard? And often the answer is, oh, it was really hard, but I'm glad we made this change or that change. And that's everything from letting someone to come into the house from home health, or a caregiver group, to help with simple things, and making sure that as a caregiver, you can go to your own doctor's appointment, or you can go grocery shopping and not worry that you're going to come back and have had something bad happen in the meantime, or that going to the grocery store is a major expedition because you both have to go, because you're not comfortable leaving your loved one at home, and these things. And because I assume we have a mix of both people with Parkinson's and caregivers out there, I take this opportunity to remind our people with Parkinson's that, that your caregiver is living through this with you, and that you have to work as a team, and remember, even though the disease is quote unquote yours, it is happening to both of you. And to also be patient and understanding, of the person that is caring for you. And that isn't it's not always an easy place to get to when you're not feeling well. But it plays a big role, I think, over the years of watching people in maintaining health, both emotional health, but also physical health, because you maintain that connectedness together, and you are you need to be you need to always be able to feel like you're on the same side at the end of the day. And so sometimes those things are easier, some situations that's easier than others. When the discussion comes to things that encroach on our independence, like driving, or or like not using your walker when maybe you've already had some falls. It can be very hard as a patient to step back and look at the impact of the illness and your decisions on not just yourself, but also on the people that care about you. And too often it tends to become an argument. Um, and it's, I think the most important thing we can do is sometimes sort of mentally switch shoes, put our feet into the shoes of the people who are caring for us and who maybe we feel a bit at odds with. And those are not easy things to come by, especially again when one doesn't feel well or doesn't feel like oneself, as you've known yourself. But it is a very important piece of human development to keep in mind, and that's really what a lot of this is about. Is just is to uh, this changes relationships, so we have to change, and we both have to adapt to these new circumstances, and hopefully, the relationships, the caring that got you this far this is actually an opportunity for it to grow and change and adapt and become better in its own way. Nothing great comes, totally easily. So um, there are many other pieces to this topic. I mean, if very nuts and bolts things like, what do we do if I get sick? What do we, those sorts of things. And, you know, do both of us have a living will that we made? Have we talked about these things? Because as a caregiver, it's just as important to look, to take care of and have these sorts of things addressed on your behalf as well as your loved one's behalf, because just because they have the diagnosis doesn't mean unexpected things medically can happen to you. And so these are not easy discussions to have. They're not fun, but they're very important, and ideally you've had these discussions long before we got to the point of, oh, I've been diagnosed with Parkinson's, now what do you and I do? um, but if you're like most of us, it's not until something new, or unexpected, or and certainly unwanted pops into your life, like Parkinson's, that one might even begin to think about that. So with that in mind, that's another really important thing. We can't. It is hard to know what's going to happen a year or two or three from now, but what we can do is at least, in areas where one can, you try to build in, contingencies, and have yourself prepared with, and have it discussed, like, well, what do we do? What do I want if I'm sick? Or what do I want if this situation comes up? So that hopefully it never comes up. But if it does, you're not having to, and this goes for both of you, you're not having to figure it out in the midst of a crisis. And so the preparedness to a degree, in talking with professionals that deal with, that write up, lawyers that work with living wills, uh, you know, there are social, oh gosh, now I'm not thinking of the name, social workers, and similar that are available in the community to go over things like, well, how does one go about looking at home care or, skilled living, skilled assisted living situations and whatnot. So, uh, those things, rather than reacting, sometimes it is better, even though they are uncomfortable, maybe not happy topics, are better to be addressed and hopefully never having, never needing to be enacted or acted on. But if you've had a conversation, you're much likely to be able to navigate, unexpected changes that might come up down the road. So I don't, again, I could probably talk for 2 or 3 hours and knock off sort of topic by topic, but we're probably, this is a good time to maybe start asking about, we have questions or specific topics that our audience wants to hear about.
One thing you did talk about that I know comes up a lot
Mhm.
is that being a caregiver, care partner versus being the warden. How do you have that happy medium of assisting without doing for somebody, and also prompting but not nagging? Like there's this it's a very fine line, and I think a lot of it's hard to straddle properly at all times, because you don't want to make someone feel bad by like, hey, it's faster if I just do it, because that diminishes someone. But at the same time, there's also that sense of, well, so I don't do that, I asked you to do it, and I asked you to do it again, and I asked you to do it again, and it still hasn't gotten done, and now I'm gonna scream.
Right,
How do you,
right.
what do you suggest for
Yes,
that fine line?
and it is a fine line. It's rarely a big fuzzy line. It's usually like, oh, you're over, you're under. And it's probably the most common point of, stress in a patient caregiver relationship. It's that, we're both adults, and yet somehow one of us feels like they're having to be more of an adult, or that they are being treated like less of an adult. Um, and again, I think when you're not in the middle of something of this sort of situation, it's important to have conversations, maybe spontaneously when you can, if it's possible, about, I know we have, uh, you know, I might, you have trouble doing this, or I might remind you a lot about this, and I don't always see a reaction. Can you tell me, what is it, what's happening for you? Or is there a way I can do this that works better for both of us? And I think this is, I would say my bias is probably more often than not, the caregiver is the one that will need to initiate this, or that, because they're probably catching the most flack. I mean, and so it's probably, I think it's fair to be, maybe to take that burden on, in terms of having taking the lead in these negotiations or discussions. I think, there are in certain areas, there are ways we can frame something that may work better. So when it comes to, I asked you to do this, and you said, uh-huh, and then it never happened, and I asked you again. I think also understanding Parkinson's and how it affects certain functions or certain processes in our mind is helpful. And so, a lot of people with Parkinson's, their attention is impacted. So their focus or their ability to hear but not listen is impaired or is affected. So I recommend, if there are things that are important to remember, I tell patients and caregivers, it's important that you are both looking each other in the eye, and you as a patient need to be a good sport and repeat back what was asked of you, so that you both know that you didn't just hear your spouse talking and you automatically said, yes, dear, because who amongst us is not guilty of doing that, who's been in, who is in any kind of long-term relationship, but that you actually heard, oh, you need me to, get that box out of the garage, and let's just confirm the details. And it's much better to do that and to agree that that's how we're going to do, things, than to, I've asked you 5 times, why won't you do this? And you start to resent each other. I will say, this is it is important as a caregiver to realize this is not stubbornness or passive aggressiveness typically. This is more just, boy, I heard you say something. I didn't want to be rude, and I said yes, and I kind of think I know what you said, but I'm distracted or I'm off somewhere else in my mind, and I just didn't realize I wasn't really listening. But as soon as you left the room, I'm back in my little zone, or I'm back on the computer and not really thinking about it. So it never really stuck to begin with. So that's one thing. I think, especially when it comes to quote unquote, remembering or carrying through on things. You know, Another thing is that might be helpful to know, and there are so many specific things that it can, we just aren't going to be able to give you a list of everything because it's just so hard to think of. But here's another example. Boy, my spouse who has Parkinson's never drinks enough water. I ask him if he's thirsty, or I ask her if she's thirsty, and she says no. And I don't understand why they're so stubborn about not drinking enough water. And then they get, lightheaded, and it's because they didn't drink enough water. And I'm so frustrated. Well, it turns out that for many people with Parkinson's, your perception of thirst or hunger is actually impaired. So you just don't recognize or don't get that urge to drink as easily. You're much less likely to feel thirsty in a conscious way. And so what I advise, families or caregivers is, rather than asking, try this. Bring them a glass of water and say, here, drink this. And what I find is, with the exception of people who maybe, patients who really have maybe some swallowing issues and they cough a lot, or they have some other discomfort in drinking water, almost no one refuses to drink the water when given to them. And the flip side is, it might be necessary to occasionally remind them, have you gotten up and gone to the bathroom? It's been an hour or two. And that's where sometimes as a caregiver, I think to be someone's clock or timer probably that's very appropriate to, to maybe, to demand or to be upset if they're not a great clock keeper is only going to add to your own frustration and to their frustration. So sometimes the hardest thing is detaching yourself a little bit from the emotional closeness that you have and being a little more robotic about those sorts of things and realizing, well, all right, if he's not or she has not been able to remember to take her medication, it is missing, has for the last 6 months been missing a dose or more every day because she gets caught up on things or he gets, lost on the time. It's probably not reasonable for me to expect them to get better at that. And I might need to become a more active. If I see that this is leading to poorer function, I'm going to probably have to be a more active part of managing medication, even though maybe on some level I'm upset because it means in my mind that they've lost independence or that they've taken a step back. And it's okay to feel that or even mourn that a little bit, but I would say it is more important on a day-to-day basis that the two of you work together to make sure that the medication's taken the right way so that they're not having off periods or having other symptoms that maybe are going to cause both of you more difficulty, on and off during the day. So I think those are maybe some of the more common, you know, nuts and bolts day-to-day situations that seem to, I think, come up for a large percentage of families and or in couples and caregivers and patients, but and that I think are maybe a bit more universal, right? So other questions or other things on the
I
list?
So I have a few questions that have come in. It's interesting because they're coming directly to me about apathy and intimacy. So I'm getting questions from both the PWPs and the care partners about, one thought is from the care partners standpoint, there is this apathy, and yet then my partner's kind of looking at me like, hey, and it's like, we've barely spoken, come on. And then hear from a person with Parkinson's kind of talked about what about overcoming the apathy, because when I am being intimate, I'm not really feeling anything because of the apathy. And it's like I'm doing it because I want to make my partner happy, but there's really nothing in it for me. And then somebody else talked about some sexual dysfunction and asked if Viagra is something good or if that's dangerous. We have a lot right now about intimacy and how the apathy is affecting it and how
Absolutely.
Parkinson's can affect functioning. And we're here, so let's talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, uh, we can start with apathy because it's probably the one where we are still trying to figure this stuff out. It's not entirely black and white, clear cut you know where apathy comes from. On one level, sure, dopamine is important in motivation and interest, but we also recognize that we can replace the dopamine and people can look really well treated. So they don't have tremor, they're not real rigid, they can move well, and yet somehow they still don't have energy or enjoyment or pleasure. It's important to bring that up, with your neurologist, with your doctor, and say, okay, and to discuss it. are you sad? So number one, obviously, depression and apathy can go together. Um, you know, and if that's the case, well then, we need to address the depression. And that's a chemical, it's a chemistry change, just like the Parkinson's is. And oftentimes depression responds very well in Parkinson's to relatively low doses of medications. And or is the apathy part of the attention deficit? Is it part of that? And maybe, is it part of somnolence? And have we addressed your sleep? Have we addressed your day-night cycle? Very hard to be passionate or be mentally there when your brain kind of hasn't quite decided whether it's daytime or nighttime, or when it doesn't really see a difference. You're half awake, you're half asleep, but you're not really one or the other at any one part of the day. So addressing those things are very important. And then there is just apathy as an entity all to itself in Parkinson's. And in some cases, stimulants and medications like that can be helpful. Those are, for some people, they work wonderfully. Other people, they might be more sensitive. They might feel more anxious, or they feel, they get palpitations or what have you. But I think they're a reasonable thing to consider in that setting. And there are ongoing clinical trials for new drugs that are specifically looking at apathy in diseases like Parkinson's, like Alzheimer's, where this is also an issue. I think there's nothing wrong with taking sort of the, not just the chemistry approach, but also talking about it. If, is there something, is there a fear or a concern, or that maybe is part of that? Maybe it's not so much apathy as being withdrawn and feeling isolated and not feeling connected, or feeling less of a person. And that's where the apathy is coming from. It's more of a self-protective thing. So just like any relationship, communication, is kind of at the start and stop, and all through the middle of it. It's one of the keys. And I think sometimes when we're talking about like an organic condition like Parkinson's, well, we get so focused on your pills, your physical therapy, those things, that we forget to just talk about it, and talk about, or maybe we're even afraid to talk about how this is affecting the person we love, because maybe we feel like, well, I can't undo this. So what if if I open this up, I'm not going to do, I can't change it. And maybe that's just going to make things worse. I will tell you that I think it rarely, if ever, makes it worse, so long as there's understanding coming from both sides, and that sharing is probably almost always the right way to go, because it helps you as a caregiver understand where, maybe a component of what's been happening to the person you care about that you just hadn't thought of, and vice versa. As a patient, or as a person with Parkinson's talking to the person who is your caregiver, they may have fears or concerns that you never thought of, and that those are affecting their ability to be intimate, or their ability to to give in a certain situation. And so talking about it is sometimes it's sort of nothing without that first, right? um you know when it comes to sexual function, certainly there are medications out there, and they do work. They seem to work for the most part every bit as well for people with Parkinson's as they do for the general population. I would say the one thing with sort of, especially say like the Cialis or Viagra, is people with Parkinson's tend to maybe be a little more at risk for low blood pressure symptoms, and these medications can definitely also lower your blood pressure. So they should always be used with caution with that in mind. I think there's also uh, from time to time there are situations often in relationship to maybe a reaction to certain medications where uh, one can become maybe over focused on intimacy, if physical intimacy, called hypersexual, hyper arousable, and that is, that might be exciting the first day, the first few times, but when when you suddenly realize that, oh my goodness, you just won't leave me alone, and how do we deal with this? I think it's, again, it's about leaving shame, or embarrassment, at the doorstep, and making sure you talk to them about it. You share, wait, I'm not feeling comfortable. I'm not feeling like this is our normal, natural, loving relationship. There's something else going on. Not, being comfortable bringing it up at the doctor's office, because it can be a sign of an adverse response to certain medications, that kind of what we call impulse control disorder or compulsive behavior. And so those also are things where awareness as a caregiver of kind of a lot of different things, being a well-educated caregiver is important, but a communicating caregiver, both with the person with Parkinson's, but also with the medical professionals that you're interacting with, is important. And my 2 cents is, when I see a person with Parkinson's, I am always delighted when they bring their spouse, caregiver, because it means I get extra information that maybe I might not get. That there are things that you as a caregiver notice, sleep quality, for instance, other behaviors, other symptoms, that as a patient we might not always be as aware of, just because, well, I don't know if I talk in my sleep, but my spouse knows if I talk in my sleep, right? If I have a little bit of dyskinesia, I might not notice it, but my spouse can see that. And so those are really simple, examples, but they, can be quite a bit more deep than that. And, when we discuss things, there's 2 ears here hearing our plan. So that's another thing. So you get back up, that when you get home, now it's on both of you to remember what we discussed, right? So you're that way you're both involved, not just in the day-to-day care, but in the dealing with and addressing issues. And because, like I said, I think it is in this day and age too old-fashioned to think about the conditions affect one person in isolation. If we are life partners, or whatever you want to term it, well then, it is healthiest, I think, to approach this interloper we call Parkinson's as a couple, as a team, as opposed to, oh, that's something that my spouse has and I'm along for the ride. That's not a very empowered, way to be or feel. It's a very helpless feeling, I think, and it can be a lonely feeling as a person with Parkinson's too. So being confident enough in each other to say this is teamwork. There are going to be, there are going to be days where you're both very angry with each other, and but there are, in any relationship, there are going to be days where you're maybe very angry with each other. And the key is, just like all those years before Parkinson's became a part of your life, is you need to use those same tools that that kept your relationship moving forward before. You got to keep using those now. What else is on our
So
list?
you did cover though, but that's part of what I think is frustrating for people is you're talking about teamwork and the apathy and the lack of insight. So therefore it's almost like I don't feel like this person is my partner anymore. I feel like I have to go to the doctor and rat on them. And and then they look at me like I betrayed them, when it's like, but you are doing these things. Like the doctor asks and you're like, everything's fine. And I'm like, everything is not fine. Or like the apathy is sort of like, this person isn't this person who I married anymore, because that person was like a mover and a shaker, no pun intended. And now they're just kind of a shaker. And we have minimal movement, and
Right.
it's just, as you're talking about the teamwork, it's like, that's I think what's very frustrating.
Right. So yes, certainly things. Well, it goes back to sort of that shift of like power, if you will, in a relationship. And like suddenly I'm making all the decisions. Suddenly I'm the one that has to be in charge of these things, and and that's where it's important. So one thing you can do is, okay, this may mean you need to reach outside of the two of you for support, and maybe also for support about maybe some of the things you're noticing, right? So that other people, maybe if it's coming from a different, someone outside of your two-person relationship, sometimes that is helpful. And is there a disproportionate amount of responsibility that falls on one's shoulder as a caregiver? I think there is. I think that is as of yet, I don't have a great answer for that, other than maybe with using part of that added responsibility to draw in people that you trust, and your person with Parkinson's would trust and listen to, and help maybe discuss difficult things like their apathy or their change in personality. And I certainly have on many occasions, semi-regularly, have third parties come in for a visit, a patient visit or a follow-up visit. So I have, the person with Parkinson's, their spouse, and maybe his best friend, of the last 20 years. And then it's not you against them. It's just, boy, we all care about you, and we see this difference. And it also reinforces it with the care provider, the doctor, or the nurse practitioner that says, okay, boy, this must be serious. Hopefully we always listen the first time, and with the least little, the softest suggestion. But sometimes it helps to have an extra person there, say, I've known him for 20 years. I am there, I see them a couple times a week. And boy, has there been a big change, or boy, is this really troubles causing a lot of difficulty, or what have you. And that's valuable. The truth is, for both persons with Parkinson's and caregivers, Parkinson's is going to demand a lot from both of you. It does change what you may have been expecting to happen, or expecting your life to be, but it doesn't have to rule it. And within, how much it rules it, I think, depends on, again, our ability to communicate together, but also to engage in help, and that can be maybe your church, it could be your friends, it could be home health services, it can be, very, you know, very much a transactional thing, or it could be very much a community uh thing, but not, engaging is going to give you more support, more ideas, because every, we're not going to be able to, or I'm not going to be able to give you, every scenario and what I would do in, in an hour talk. But chances are you're not the first person to be in this, in whatever particular situation is going on at home. And somebody out there has probably managed it, as well, if hopefully got better than how you're doing now, or maybe they failed the first time but learned something, and they can share that with you and help the two of you, uh, you know, avoid maybe the hardship that they went through. And so, again, resources, whether it's, whether it's the PMD Alliance, whether it's the local support group, whether it's one of the other national groups, whether it's your church, whether it's the senior center. There are so many resources out there that I think we're not fully aware of, much of the time, that um that we need to be taking advantage of, or that we need to explore. And they are out there. There is support out there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samanta. We are out of time,
Okay.
but
I
you just did an
rambled.
incredible job kind of humanizing. No, but you humanized it. You really kind of just said to people, I, as a practitioner, I see you as a person, not just as a person with Parkinson's or just a care partner. I see you. And I just think that was wonderful that, you're aware that it's like, yes, this care partner is doing the work of about 8 people. And, thank you. Or this PWP, this is what's going on, but there's so much more than just their Parkinson's. So thank you so much for giving us your time today and sharing your insight.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everybody that logged on. And hopefully, everyone got something that they could use. So, and as always, there's, I'm not supposed to play favorites, but if everybody covers their ears, my favorite organization is Alliance. So you guys do such a wonderful job, really helping the community and caring and providing so many resources. I'm always thankful for everything you guys do. So,
as always, we do our wave of gratitude here at PMD Alliance. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Appreciate it. Bye, everyone. Have a great
bye.
weekday.